The envelope, smudged with a dark purple smear of last summer's chokeberry jam and a fine grey dust from the coal scuttle, lay on the rough pine table. Right beside it, its blue steel looking almost black in the weak morning light, was Thomas Caldwell's Schofield revolver, fully loaded. Eleanor West sat perfectly still on a wooden chair, her back straight as a fence post, her hands folded in the lap of her new calico dress. The dress was a soft yellow, like butter, and it felt all wrong. Outside the little Wyoming cabin, the sky was just turning from black to a watery grey blue. A lone bird was trying our song. Inside, two smells fought for control of the air. One was good and hopeful, the sour, yeasty smell of the sourdough starter Thomas had given her just yesterday, bubbling away in its jar on the shelf. He'd said it was his mother's. The other smell was older and deeper, dug into the very logs of the cabin, the sharp, cold scent of spent gunpowder and oiled metal. Eleanor's heart was not pounding. That was the strange thing. It felt like a small, frozen stone in her chest. Her eyes moved from the envelope to the gun and back again. Upstairs, in the small carpet bag at the foot of the bed she had not slept in, was a piece of paper that promised her a new life. It was a mail-order bride contract, signed by her in Boston on March 3, 1892, and by Thomas Caldwell out here in Sage Creek, Wyoming. It promised her safety, companionship, and a fresh start as Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. She had arrived by stagecoach just 2 days ago. The man who now watched her from over by the stone fireplace was Thomas Caldwell. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters, with broad shoulders and hands that looked more used to holding an axe than a pen. He wasn't holding anything now. He was just standing there, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the mantel, a forgotten tin coffee cup beside his hand. The silence between them was thick enough to taste, and it tasted like fear. Eleanor had woken up that morning, her second morning as a wife in name only, determined to begin. Thomas had been quiet, kind in a distant way, giving her space. So she had decided to bake. She had kneaded the dough with her own hands, feeling the flour grit under her nails, hoping the simple, good work would calm her nerves. She had stoked the iron stove, got the fire just right, and slid the loaf in. That was when the knock had come at the door. A single, hard rap. Thomas had gotten it. A rider, his face hidden by a bandana against the dawn chill, had thrust the envelope into Thomas's hand and wheeled his horse away without a word. Thomas had closed the door, his movements slow and heavy. He had looked at the envelope, then at Eleanor, his eyes a flat, unreadable grey. He had walked to the table, placed the envelope down, and then, with a deliberate calm that scared her more than shouting, he had taken his revolver from its holster on the wall and placed it next to the letter. He had nodded for her to open it. Inside wasn't a letter from home. It was a bounty poster. The paper was crisp, official. At the top was a sketch of a woman's face. The drawing was rough, but the eyes, wide and frightened, and the set of the mouth, they were hers. The name beneath it screamed in bold black type, *** Eleanor West, alias Lorna June. *** the crime, *** wanted for the murder of a Pinkerton agent. *** the reward, $5,000. And the worst words, printed at the bottom like an afterthought, *** dead or alive. *** The bread. She could smell it beginning to toast at the edges, a warm, normal smell that now felt like a cruel joke. That bird kept singing outside, a cheerful trill that seemed to laugh at the terrible stillness inside the cabin. She had come all this way to escape the past, to be someone new. She had baked bread. And the past had found her, delivered by a stranger on horseback, smudged with jam and coal dust. Thomas finally moved. He pushed himself away from the mantel, the heels of his boots scraping on the plank floor. The sound was terribly loud. He didn't walk toward the gun. He walked toward the window, his big frame blocking the growing light. He stared out at the empty trail that led to Sage Creek, 10 miles east. Eleanor watched the muscles in his back tighten under his red flannel shirt. He stood there for what felt like an hour, watching nothing. She could hear the fire crackle in the stove. She could hear the slow, steady tick, tick, tick of fat from last night's supper dripping from the chimney hook into the flames below. She could hear her own breath, shallow and quiet. She waited for him to speak, to yell, to reach for that gun. When he turned around, his face was like stone, but his eyes had changed. They weren't flat anymore. They were the color of the creek in winter, just where the ice starts to form, clear, but with a deep, dangerous cold underneath. He walked back to the table. His hand reached out. For a wild second, Eleanor thought he would pick up the revolver. Instead, his fingers, calloused and strong, closed around the bounty poster. He didn't look at her. He looked at the paper as if it were a poisonous snake. Slowly, with a careful, brutal precision, he folded the poster. Once. Twice. He made the creases sharp. Then he turned to the iron door of the stove, pulled the latch, and the firelight spilled out, painting his face in orange and shadow. He thrust the folded paper into the heart of the flames. It caught immediately, the edges curling black, the words 5,000 glowing for a second before vanishing into ash. He closed the stove door with a soft, final asterisk clank dot asterisk. The cabin was dim again. The good smell of baking bread was winning now, filling the space. But the truth was in the air, heavier than any scent. Thomas let out a long, slow breath he seemed to have been holding forever. He finally looked at her, really looked at her. Not at the woman in the drawing, but at Eleanor, in her yellow dress, sitting frozen at his table. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a stream. "It says dead or alive," he said. The words weren't an accusation. They were just a fact, hanging in the warm air. Eleanor found she couldn't speak. She just nodded, a tiny movement of her chin. Thomas didn't nod back. He looked from her to the window, then to the gun on the table. He made his decision. "Saddle the chestnut mare," he said, his voice all gravel and resolve. "Now." He wasn't telling her to leave. He wasn't throwing her out. He was telling her they were leaving. Together. A wave of something that wasn't quite relief, but wasn't terror either, washed through her. She stood up, her legs feeling wobbly and strange. She moved past him, out the cabin door into the chill of the Wyoming morning. The chestnut mare, a sweet-tempered creature named Bonnie, was in the small corral. Eleanor's fingers, numb with cold and shock, fumbled with the leather straps of the saddle. The metal of the buckles was icy to the touch. As she worked, she heard movements inside the cabin. The sound of his heavy trunk being dragged. The clink of ammunition. The firm, sure sound of a gun belt being fastened. He had burned the poster. He was saddling his own horse, a big dun gelding. He was coming with her. Why? The question screamed in her head. $5,000 was a fortune. It could buy this valley. He had known her for 2 days. As she led Bonnie out, Thomas emerged from the cabin. He had a bedroll and a sack of supplies slung over his shoulder. In the clear morning light, she saw the details she'd been too nervous to see before. The tiny network of lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, a small, pale scar through his left eyebrow. He was a real man, not just a signature on a contract. And he was choosing to believe her, or at least, to protect her. He checked her saddle with a quick, efficient tug on the cinch, his hand brushing hers for a second. His skin was warm. "We'll head for the high country," he said, more to himself than to her. "Buy us some time to think." He helped her up into the saddle, his hands firm on her waist. Then he swung up onto his own horse with an easy grace. He took one last look at the little cabin, at the thin line of smoke rising from the stovepipe. The bread was definitely burning now, a dark, acrid smell mixing with the pine. He didn't seem to care. He turned his horse toward the west, away from the rising sun, away from the trail to town. "Stay close," he said. And as Eleanor nudged Bonnie forward to follow him, a single, clear thought cut through the fog in her mind. That bounty poster was dated February 14th. Over 2 weeks ago. Thomas had sent the final letter confirming her travel arrangements on February 20th. He had sent for a mail-order bride asterisk after asterisk the poster, with her name and face on it, was already circulating. The writer hadn't just found her. Someone had sent him here. And Thomas, he hadn't been surprised. He had been waiting. The sound of Thomas's palm hitting the table wasn't a slap. It was a sharp, final crack, like a piece of firewood splitting right down the middle. On the table, the heavy Schofield revolver actually jumped an inch, the metal scraping on the wood. Eleanor's whole body flinched. She felt the jolt of it in her teeth, and a sudden, sharp stitch pinched her side, as if she'd been running for miles. He didn't look at her. He pushed back from the table so fast his chair leg screeched, and in 3 long strides he was at the cabin's single window. He stood there, his broad back blocking the new morning light, turning the room dim and gloomy. The red flannel of his shirt stretched tight across his shoulders. She could see every muscle in his back and arms pulled tense, like ropes holding a heavy weight. He didn't move. He just stared out at the empty trail, the one that led back to Sage Creek and the rest of the world. The silence in the cabin was total, but it was a noisy kind of silence. Eleanor could hear the frantic drumbeat of her own heart in her ears. She could hear the soft, desperate sound of her own breathing. And underneath it all, she heard the slow, maddening asterisk tick, tick, tick asterisk of fat dripping from the iron chimney hook into the fire below. Each drop hit the embers with a tiny, angry hiss. It was a clock counting down to something, but she didn't know what. 5 minutes passed. Maybe 10. The square of sunlight from the window crept slowly across the floorboards, touching the toe of her sensible black boot. Thomas didn't move a muscle. He was a statue of a man, carved from worry and decision. The smell of the burned bread was getting stronger, a bitter, charcoal smell that filled the small space. It was the smell of a normal morning, ruined. Finally, he turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. The morning light caught his face now, and his eyes weren't the flat grey from before. They were the colour of the creek that ran behind the cabin in January, clear, but with a layer of ice on top and a deep, moving cold underneath. He looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't see anger or accusation. She saw a kind of grim calculation, like a man checking his supplies before a long, hard winter. He walked back to the table. His boots were quiet on the planks this time. His gaze fell on the bounty poster, the one that showed her face and promised a fortune. He didn't pick it up gently. His calloused fingers, nails edged with dirt from yesterday's chores, closed around it and lifted it like it was a dead thing. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the poster, at the words $5,000. A shadow of something, disgust, maybe, or disappointment, flickered across his face. Then, with a careful, almost gentle motion, he began to fold it. He made a sharp crease along the line of her sketched jaw. He folded it again, hiding the words dead or alive. His hands were steady. So terribly steady. He turned to the big iron stove, the one she'd baked the bread in not an hour before. The fire inside was still glowing. He pulled the little iron latch and swung the door open. A wave of heat rolled out, and the firelight painted his face in warm gold and deep, dancing shadow. For a second, he just held the folded paper over the opening. Then, he let it go. The poster fell into the flames. The edges curled black instantly. The paper seemed to sigh, and for one brilliant moment, the number 5,000 glowed a bright, fiery orange against the blackening sheet. Then it crumpled into a small, angry flower of flame, and was gone. Thomas closed the stove door. The gentle asterisk clank asterisk of the latch was the loudest sound Eleanor had ever heard. The room felt different. The poster was gone, but the words were still here, hanging in the air between them, mixing with the smell of smoke and burned bread. Thomas let out a long, slow breath. He wiped his hands on his trousers, as if wiping away the very idea of that money. They knew where to look, he said. His voice was low and rough. Those 5 words sank into Eleanor. They weren't a question. They were the cold, hard truth. The rider on horseback hadn't been searching every cabin in Wyoming. He had come right here, to Thomas Caldwell's door, to the exact spot where the mail-order bride from Boston was supposed to be. Someone had told him. Someone had connected Thomas Caldwell to Eleanor West. Thomas moved again, this time with purpose. He went to a heavy trunk in the corner, the one he'd brought down from the loft yesterday. He flipped it open. Inside, she saw not clothes, but boxes of ammunition, a coil of rope, tins of beans, and a wrapped bundle of jerky. He was packing for a journey. He wasn't sending her away. He was planning to go with her. "Saddle the chestnut mare," he said, not looking up as he counted cartridges. "Now." The order broke the frozen spell holding Eleanor in the chair. She stood up, her legs feeling shaky and strange, like they weren't entirely her own. She moved past him, careful not to touch him, and pushed open the cabin door. The morning air hit her, cold and clean and shocking. It was a beautiful day. The sky was a vast, endless blue, and the mountains in the distance were a crisp purple. It was the kind of day that promised adventure, not running for your life. Bonnie, the chestnut mare, whickered softly from the small corral. Eleanor's fingers, stiff with cold and fear, fumbled with the gate's simple latch. She got it open and walked toward the horse. Bonnie nudged her shoulder with a soft, velvety nose, looking for a treat. The simple, gentle act nearly made Eleanor cry. She leaned her forehead against the mare's warm neck for just a second, breathing in the smell of hay and horsehair and honest sweat. She dragged the heavy saddle from the fence rail. The leather was cold and stiff. Her fingers, even in her thin gloves, felt numb and clumsy as she tried to thread the cinch strap through the buckle. She couldn't get it. The strap kept slipping. A wave of hot frustration and panic rose in her throat. She was going to fail at this simple task, and it would get them caught. A shadow fell across her. Thomas was there. He didn't say anything. He just gently took the strap from her trembling hands. His own hands, so much larger and rougher, made the task look effortless. He tightened the cinch with a firm, practiced pull, the leather groaning in protest. He checked the bridle, his movements quick and sure. "We'll take the ridge trail," he said, his voice quiet. "It's rougher, but it's hidden. Puts more rock between us and anyone following the main road." He helped her up into the saddle. His hands were firm on her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. For a brief moment, she was suspended in the air, the world tilting, and then she settled into the leather. He handed her the reins, their fingers brushing. His skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the cold metal of the buckle she'd been struggling with. He swung up onto his own horse, the big dun gelding named Captain, with an easy, powerful motion. He took one last, long look at the cabin. Smoke still drifted from the chimney. The chipped blue door was shut. It looked peaceful. It looked like a home. He turned Captain away from it, his face set. "Stay close," he said, and nudged his horse forward, heading not east toward town, but west, toward the steep, rocky shoulders of the Bighorn Mountains. Eleanor clicked her tongue and followed, Bonnie falling into step behind Captain. The rhythm of the horse's walk began to settle her nerves. The sun was fully up now, warming her back. They rode in silence for an hour, the only sounds the crunch of hooves on gravel, the creak of leather, and the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cooler. Eleanor's mind, which had been a buzzing blank, began to work again. It went back to the poster. The date, February 14th. She remembered it clearly, printed right under the sheriff's seal. And she remembered the last letter from Thomas, the one that had finally convinced her to buy the stagecoach ticket. It had been sent on February 20th. The numbers tumbled in her head. He had known. He had known a bounty was on her head when he sent that final letter. He had invited her here anyway. The rider hadn't just stumbled upon the remote cabin. He'd been directed here. Thomas hadn't burned the poster out of sudden kindness. He had burned it because it was proof that had arrived at his door, and he couldn't let it exist. He wasn't just protecting her. He was part of the story. The question wasn't just who was after her. The question, the one that made her blood run cold, was why had Thomas Caldwell, a stranger in Wyoming, sent for a wanted woman? She looked at his back as he rode ahead of her, guiding them up a narrow, winding path only a local would know. He was a mystery, a man who baked with his mother's sourdough starter and kept a loaded revolver on his wall. A man who burned bounty posters and led her into the wilderness without a single explanation. He had been waiting for her all along, but not for the reason she dreamed of on that long stagecoach ride from Boston. The real journey, she realized, was just beginning, and it wasn't just a journey away from danger, but a journey into the truth of the man she had promised to marry. And in that moment, despite the fear, a tiny spark of determination lit inside her. She would find out why. The rain began on the second night, just as the last of the sunset bled away behind the mountains. It didn't start with a gentle sprinkle. It was a sudden, cold deluge that fell from the black sky like a waterfall, soaking through Eleanor's wool coat in minutes. It tasted like wet stone and metal, and it stung her face. Beside her, Thomas urged Captain forward, his hat pulled low. "There's an overhang up ahead," he shouted over the roar, his voice barely reaching her. They pushed the tired horses up a slippery, rocky incline. Bonnie slipped once, her hoof skidding on a wet shale, and Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. But the mare found her footing, snorting in protest. The overhang was just a deep cut in the side of a granite cliff, but it was dry. They ducked under it, leading the horses into the shallow cave. The sudden quiet, broken only by the drumming of rain on the ground just beyond the rock, was a relief. They were both shivering. Water dripped from the brim of Thomas's hat, and Eleanor's hair was plastered to her neck in cold, dark strings. Without a word, Thomas pulled the bedrolls from behind their saddles. They were damp on the outside, but the thick wool inside was still dry. He spread one on the rocky floor of the overhang, and held the other open like a blanket. "We'll have to share the warmth," he said, his voice flat and practical. "Or we'll freeze by morning." Eleanor hesitated for only a second. The cold was a physical ache in her bones, deeper than pride or fear. She sat beside him on the bedroll, and he wrapped the second blanket around both of their shoulders. He was careful, keeping a few inches of space between them, but his body heat was like a furnace. She could feel the solid line of his arm next to hers, and slowly, the violent shivering in her own body began to ease. For a long time, they just sat there, listening to the rain. The world had shrunk to this small pocket of stone, the smell of wet horse and damp wool, and the shared heat under the blanket. Eleanor stared out at the curtain of water, watching it catch the occasional faint light from a break in the clouds. She wasn't seeing the rain, though. She was seeing a narrow tenement hallway in Boston, smelling of boiled cabbage and mildew. She was seeing a man's face, a Pinkerton agent named Silas Granger, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. He had her sister's wedding band in his hand, a cheap little brass ring, turning it over and over. "A debt is a debt, Miss West," he had said. Her father's gambling debt. The agent's hand had closed around her sister's wrist, too tight. Clara had cried out. The sound had been small and scared in the dim hallway. Eleanor had acted before she'd thought. The fireplace poker was cold and heavy in her hand. She hadn't meant to swing it so hard. The crack it made against his shoulder was sickening. He'd shouted, let go of Clara, and turned on her. His hand had gone to his coat, and in the shadows, she thought she saw the glint of a gun. Her father's old pistol, hidden in the drawer of the hall table. She didn't remember pulling the trigger. Just the unbelievable, deafening asterisk boom asterisk that filled the tiny space, and the way Silas Granger's face went slack with surprise before he fell. The memory was so vivid she could smell the gunpowder in the damp mountain air. She wasn't a victim in that memory. She was a creature of chaos, of ruin. She had brought that ruin with her, all the way from the cobblestone streets of Boston to this rain-soaked ledge in Wyoming. She had left her sister behind in a fog of tears and promises to write. She had run, becoming Lorna June, then Eleanor West again, always looking over her shoulder. And now her running had led her here, to a man who was cold and silent beside her, who had his own reasons for being in this mess. "It's my father's fault," Thomas said suddenly, his voice a low rumble in the dark. She jumped a little. She'd almost forgotten he was there. "Not yours. Mine." He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the rain. His name was Joseph Caldwell. He wasn't a bad man. Just weak. He loved a card game. Loved it more than he loved keeping the ranch. Thomas paused, picking up a small pebble and rolling it between his fingers. Ran up a debt to a man in Cheyenne. A man named Darius Holt. Not the kind of debt you just pay back with money. It was a debt of favor, of silence. When my father died 2 years ago, Holt came to see me. Said the debt had transferred. I've been paying it in installments ever since. In cattle. In land. In keeping quiet about things I've seen on Holt's shipments coming through the territory. He tossed the pebble out into the rain. $5,000 would clear it. Wipe the slate clean. Holt would own me no more. The words hung in the cold air. $5,000. The exact number on the bounty poster. Eleanor felt the truth settle over her, colder than the rain. This wasn't just her nightmare. It was his, too. They were trapped in the same bad dream. So you saw the poster, she whispered, her throat tight. And you wrote for me anyway. I wrote for a wife, he said, and there was a rough edge to his voice now. The poster, that was a complication. I don't know what I thought. That it was a mistake. That I could handle it. That maybe two tangled problems could somehow make one straight line. He finally turned his head to look at her. In the gloom, his face was all sharp angles and shadow. I was wrong to bring you into this. I see that now. The rain began to slacken, fading to a soft, steady patter. The impossible choice laid itself out in front of Eleanor, as clear as the path they'd ridden up. She could take Bonnie. She could slip away in what was left of the night, ride east, and disappear into the vast, empty plains. She could be a ghost again, always running, always alone. Or she could ride with him, not away from trouble, but straight toward its source, toward Cheyenne, toward this Darius Holt, and toward the truth of why that bounty poster had found its way to Thomas Caldwell's door so quickly. Turning east meant trusting only herself, the scared girl from Boston with a fire poker and a stolen gun. Turning west meant trusting this silent, complicated stranger whose warmth was the only thing keeping the chill of the night at bay. She looked at his profile, at the weary set of his jaw. He had burned the poster. He had shared his blanket. He had told her his shame. Holt, she said, the name feeling strange in her mouth. He's the one who sent the rider. Thomas nodded once, a short, sharp movement. He knows you're here. The bounty is his way of forcing my hand. It's a test. Give you up, clear the debt. Or defy him, she finished. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Defying Darius Holt, he said quietly, is something people don't generally do twice. The rain stopped completely. In the sudden, ringing silence, the world felt new-washed and huge. A few brave stars poked through the ragged clouds. The clean, wet smell of pine and earth filled the air. The cold was still there, biting at her cheeks, but under the blanket, where her arm pressed against his, there was a solid, undeniable warmth. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. The frozen stone that had been her heart for days began to crack, not with fear, but with a decision. Running east was the ghost's path. It was the path of the girl she had been. The woman on this ledge, who had baked bread and sat by a fire and heard a man speak his father's shame, was someone else. We go to Cheyenne, she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was quieter, but it didn't shake. Thomas turned fully to look at her, his eyes searching her face in the starlight. He didn't ask if she was sure. He just held her gaze, and in his, she saw the same grim resolve that had made him burn the poster. He gave one slow, solemn nod. All right, he said. And in that moment, curled under a shared blanket on a mountain ledge, Eleanor West realized something. The contract, the one she'd signed in Boston, the one that promised a simple, peaceful life as a rancher's wife, that was a lie. It had been a fairy tale. This, the cold and the trust and the shared enemy, this was the real agreement. This was the promise they were making now, not on paper, but in the quiet of a storm that had passed. They weren't running away anymore. They were walking, together, into the fire. And for the first time since she'd seen that envelope on the table, she didn't feel entirely afraid. She felt awake. The morning of the fourth day dawned clear and sharp as a piece of broken glass. Eleanor stood by a small, icy creek, watching the water rush over smooth stones. In the distance, the hazy smudge on the horizon was Cheyenne. It wasn't a welcoming sight. It looked like a stain of smoke and trouble. She could feel Thomas watching her from where he was checking Captain's hooves. She turned and walked toward him, the dried grass crunching under her boots. Her hands, which had shaken so badly just days ago saddling Bonnie, were steady at her sides. "Thomas," she said. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I need you to teach me," she said. "Not just how to sit a horse. How to really use it." She nodded toward the Schofield revolver, which rested in its holster on his saddle. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired, and then thoughtful. He studied her face for a long moment, his eyes taking in the new set of her mouth, the directness of her gaze. "All right," he said, simple as that. He didn't make a big ceremony of it. He took the gun, showed her how to check it was loaded, 6 cartridges, the brass ends gleaming, and how to hold its weight. "It's not about being strong," he said, his voice low and calm. "It's about being still. The gun will jump. You let it. You just make sure it's jumping where you aim." The first time she pulled the trigger, the noise was a physical thing. It punched the air and slammed against her ears. The recoil kicked her arm up and back, a surprising, powerful jolt that rattled her teeth. A spray of dirt kicked up 20 feet in front of a rotten log. She hadn't even come close. She lowered the gun, her ears ringing. Her heart was hammering. She expected him to be disappointed. Instead, he just nodded. Again. "Remember to breathe out first." She did it again. And again. Her shoulder began to ache. The world narrowed to the sight at the end of the barrel, the feel of the cold trigger under her finger, the slow exhale of breath. On the 12th shot, she hit the log. A splinter of old wood popped into the air. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest, not happiness, but a kind of solid certainty. Her hands, which she had thought were only good for sewing and baking, could learn this new, hard language. They spent the afternoon riding closer to Cheyenne, following a dry creek bed that Thomas said would keep them out of sight. The land began to change, the open wilderness giving way to scattered fences and the distant smell of cattle. Eleanor's senses felt sharpened. She noticed everything: a hawk circling on a thermal, the way Bonnie's ears flicked forward at a strange sound, a faint thread of wood smoke on the wind that wasn't from their camp. It was in a narrow, rocky canyon, just as the sun was starting to dip and paint the walls orange, that Bonnie's ears pinned back and she let out a soft, worried snort. Thomas pulled Captain up short, his hand going up in a silent fist. He tilted his head, listening. The sound was the faint asterisk clink asterisk of a loose horseshoe on stone. Then another, from the other side of the canyon. They were boxed in. 2 riders emerged from behind large boulders at either end of the short canyon. They were rough-looking men, dressed in dust-colored clothes. One had a thick red beard. The other was younger, with a narrow, hungry face. They didn't look like lawmen. They looked like men who read bounty posters and did math in their heads. $5,000 was a lot of math. "Well, now," said the man with the red beard, his voice echoing slightly in the stone walls. "Look what the cat dragged into the canyon. That's a mighty familiar-looking face, ain't it, Eli?" The younger one, Eli, grinned, showing a gap in his teeth. "Spit-tin image of that drawing, Jed." Thomas didn't say a word. His face was a calm mask, but Eleanor saw the tiny muscle in his jaw flex. He subtly shifted in his saddle, putting himself slightly between her and the man named Jed. "You're mistaken," Thomas said, his voice level and firm. "This is my wife. We are just passing through to see family." Jed spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. "I'm sure she is. And I'm sure the sheriff in Cheyenne will be right interested in meeting your family. Now, why don't you both real nice and slow get down off them horses?" Thomas's eyes met Eleanor's for a split second. There was a message in them. A plan. He gave an almost imperceptible nod toward a cluster of rocks to her left. "All right," Thomas said loudly, holding his hands up. "No trouble. We are getting down." He started to slowly dismount on the side closest to Jed, drawing the man's attention. This was the moment. Eleanor let all the fear, all the panic of the last week, rise up in her throat. She made a small, terrified sound, a whimper that wasn't entirely acting. She clumsily half fell, half slid from Bonnie's saddle, stumbling into the open ground between the horses. She hugged her arms around herself, her shoulders shaking. She was the picture of a helpless, frightened woman, just like the one everyone was expecting to find. "Please," she sobbed, the word hitching in her throat. "We don't have any money. Just let us go." Eli, the younger one, chuckled and swung down from his horse. "Ain't you sweet?" he said, taking a few confident steps toward her. "Don't you worry. We'll get you to town safe and sound. That reward'll spend just fine." He was 10 feet away. Then 5. His hand was outstretched, not for a weapon, but to grab her arm. He was grinning, completely sure of himself. As his shadow fell over her, Eleanor stopped shaking. She dropped her arms. Her right hand went to the deep pocket of her riding skirt, the pocket Thomas had quietly reinforced with a piece of leather 2 nights ago by the fire. Her fingers closed around the checked grip of the Schofield. She pulled it out, the metal heavy and sure in her hand. She didn't raise it to aim. She just pointed it from her hip, as Thomas had shown her for close work, and pulled the trigger. The bang was enormous in the confined space. A puff of dust exploded from the front of Eli's leather vest, right over his heart. He didn't cry out. He just made a small, surprised oof sound, like all the air had been punched from his lungs. The grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure, simple shock. He took one stumbling step back, looked down at his chest, and then crumpled to his knees before falling face first into the dirt. At the same moment, from behind the rocks where Thomas had ducked, another shot rang out. Jed, who had been fumbling for his own rifle, shouted and dropped the weapon, clutching his shoulder. He stared, wide-eyed, from his wounded partner to Eleanor, who was still holding the smoking gun, her face pale but utterly calm. "You!" Jed gasped. Thomas stepped out from behind the rocks, his own gun trained on Jed. "Drop your belt. Now." His voice brooked no argument. Shaking, Jed used his good hand to undo his gun belt and let it fall. Thomas quickly gathered the rifles from both men, and the pistol from Jed's fallen belt. He checked on Eli, then shook his head once at Eleanor. The man was unconscious, his breath ragged. They worked quickly and silently. They took the 2 riders' horses, their canteens full of fresh water, and their small sack of supplies, hardtack, coffee, and a little bacon. Thomas used a bandage from their own kit to roughly bind Jed's shoulder. "The town of Rock Creek is 4 miles east. You can walk. Tell Darius Holt," Thomas said, leaning close to the wounded man, "that the debt is now between him and me. Leave her name out of it." They rode out of the canyon as the sun finally dipped below the rim, leaving the stone walls in deep purple shadow. They didn't stop for miles, pushing the new horses hard. Only when full dark had settled and the lights of Cheyenne were a distinct glow to the northeast did Thomas signal to stop by a small, hidden spring. Eleanor slid off Bonnie. Her legs were trembling now, the reaction setting in. The smell of cordites seemed to be stuck in her nose. She walked to the spring, sank to her knees, and splashed the cold water on her face. It dripped from her chin, mixing with the tears that had finally come, not tears of fear, but of a huge, overwhelming release. She felt Thomas come up beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, a solid presence in the dark. After a long while, she spoke, her voice raw. "I thought I would feel like a monster." "Do you?" he asked quietly. She thought about it. She thought about the Pinkerton agent in Boston and the man in the canyon. One had meant her harm. One had seen her as a payday. She saw her own reflection, broken and rippling in the moonlit spring. "No," she whispered. "I feel like a person who doesn't want to be a prize anymore." Thomas nodded. He understood. He built a tiny, careful fire, just enough to boil coffee. As they drank the bitter, hot liquid, he laid out the only plan that made sense. Holt was in Cheyenne, likely at a saloon called the Gilded Queen. He'd be surrounded by men who work for him. Walking in together would be a suicide pact. Tomorrow, "I walk in alone," Thomas said, staring into the small flames. "I draw his attention, all of it. I'll be the distraction, the man who finally grew a spine to defy him, while he's focused on me." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a trust that went deeper than any contract. "You're the diversion," he said. He didn't mean the frightened woman in the canyon. He meant her, Eleanor. Clever, observant, and now, capable. While Holt was busy with Thomas, she would have a chance to find the proof Thomas said existed, the ledger book where Holt kept his real accounts, the records of the debts like the one held over Thomas's father. It was kept in Holt's office, upstairs at the Gilded Queen. It was a desperate plan. But it was their plan. As they doused the fire, the lights of Cheyenne glittered coldly in the distance, like a cluster of watching, hostile eyes. They slept in shifts, but Eleanor found she could sleep. The gun, cleaned and reloaded, lay beside her. Its weight was no longer a mystery. It was a tool. And tomorrow, they would use all the tools they had. The next evening, as the sun set and the dusty streets of Cheyenne grew loud with evening life, Thomas Caldwell straightened his coat. He looked at Eleanor one last time, gave her that same slow, solemn nod from the mountain ledge, and turned. He walked across the wide, rutted street, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. The swinging doors of the Gilded Queen saloon glowed with lamplight. He pushed them open, and the noisy warmth of the place swallowed him whole. From the shadows of the stable across the street, Eleanor watched him go. She took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the reinforced pocket of her skirt, the solid weight within it. She waited for the count of 30. Then, she stepped out of the shadows and moved not toward the bright saloon doors, but toward the narrow, dark alley that ran along its side, leading to the back stairs. Her heart was a steady drum, not a frantic bird. She was ready. The chipped pine table was smooth under Eleanor's fingertips. A single, clean square of morning sunlight fell across its surface, warm as a hand. A week ago, this same table had held an envelope smudged with jam and coal dust, and the cold, heavy weight of a revolver. Now, it held only a disassembled Schofield, its parts laid out on a soft cloth like a strange, metal puzzle. Eleanor sat there, an oiled rag in her hand, working methodically. She cleaned the cylinder, each of the 6 chambers, wiping away the faint grey residue. The metal was cool and precise in her grip. She ran the rag down the barrel, peering through it at the window, seeing a perfect, tiny circle of the bright blue Wyoming sky. Outside, the steady, rhythmic asterisk thwack asterisk of an axe splitting would echoed through the clear, cold air. Asterisk thwack dot asterisk pause. Asterisk thwack dot asterisk it was a good sound. A sound of preparation, of a man tending to his home. A week. It was hard to believe only 7 days had passed since that terrible dawn. After the chaos in Cheyenne, the world had seemed to hold its breath for a few long, uncertain days. They had stayed hidden in a little boarding house on the edge of town, owned by a friend of Thomas's mother, a woman who asked no questions. They waited while the marshal, a stern man with a silver star, looked over the ledger book Eleanor had taken from Darius Holt's office. It wasn't just Thomas's father's debt recorded in that book. It was a list of secrets, of pressured men and stolen goods. It was enough. They heard the news in pieces, whispered over coffee in the boarding house kitchen. Darius Holt was in the federal jail in Laramie. The bounty on Eleanor West hadn't been formally lifted yet. These things moved like cold molasses, the marshal said, but the man who'd posted it had no power now. The warrant from Boston was being questioned, the testimony of a frightened sister named Clara now being heard over the word of a disgraced Pinkerton agent. The path to clearing her name was finally visible, a long road, but a real one. The morning they rode back to the cabin, a quiet had settled between them. It wasn't the tense silence of the first journey. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind where you don't need to fill the space with words because you understand what's in each other's minds. They had seen the worst of each other, and the best, too. They had walked into a fire together and had come out the other side, a little scorched, but whole. Now, back home, life didn't just return to normal. It created a new normal. Eleanor finished cleaning the last part of the revolver, the grip. She slotted the cylinder back into the frame with a satisfying, solid asterisk click star. The weapon was whole again, but it felt different in her hand. It wasn't a symbol of fear anymore. It was a tool, like Thomas's axe or her own rolling pin. She knew its weight, its purpose, and its cost. She placed it on the shelf by the door, not hidden, but not on display either. Just there. Then she turned to the stove. She had fed the sourdough starter that morning, Thomas's mother's starter, and it was bubbly and alive. She had kneaded a new loaf, the flour dusting her wrists like fine snow. She opened the iron door now and felt the wave of heat on her face. The bread was golden brown, perfect. She pulled it out with a thick cloth, the crust crackling softly as it cooled. The smell filled the cabin, yeasty, warm, and deeply good. This time, she would not let it burn. The asterisk thwack asterisk of the axe stopped. She heard the soft thud of split logs being piled against the side of the cabin. A moment later, the door opened, and a rush of cold, clean air swept in, making the fire in the stove flutter. Thomas stood in the doorway, his shoulders dusted with wood chips, his breath making little clouds in the room's warmer air. He had a small bundle of kindling in his arms. He looked at her, then at the loaf of bread steaming on the table, then at the clean gun on the shelf. His gaze came back to her. He didn't smile. Thomas wasn't a big smiler, but the lines around his eyes softened. He gave a single, slow nod. It was the same nod he'd given her on the mountain ledge, in the canyon, outside the saloon. It meant asterisk I see you. We are here. Asterisk. He came in, kicked the door closed with his heel, and stacked the kindling neatly by the hearth. He washed his hands in the basin, the water turning grey from the wood and dirt. He dried them on a towel and then just stood for a moment, looking around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. The sunlight on the floor. The bread. Her. Snow's coming, he said finally, his voice quiet. Maybe tonight. Eleanor walked to the window. The sky was still that brilliant, endless blue, but the wind had a new bite to it, and the mountains in the distance looked sharper, whiter. She believed him. He knew this land, its signs and its seasons. We are ready, she said. And they were. The woodpile was high. The pantry was stocked. The cabin was solid. Later that afternoon, Eleanor went out to the corral to give Bonnie an apple. The mare lipped it gently from a palm, her breath warm and sweet. As Eleanor leaned on the fence, she saw it, the first, lazy flake. It drifted down, spinning like a tiny feather. Then another. And another. Soon, the air was filled with a silent, gentle swirl of white. It dusted the corral fence, clung to Bonnie's dark mane, and began to quietly cover the hard ground, softening all the rough edges of the world. It covered their old tracks, the ones from their frantic ride out a week ago, and the newer ones from their calm ride home. It was painting over the past, not to erase it, but to give them a clean, new page. She stayed there until her fingertips were numb with cold, watching the snow gather. When she went back inside, Thomas was at the table, mending a harness strap with a thick needle and strong thread. She sat across from him, picking up her own mending, a small tear in the yellow calico dress she'd worn that first morning. They worked in that comfortable quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the asterisk pop asterisk of his needle through leather, and the soft whisper of snow against the window. When the light began to fade, Thomas lit the lamp. Its warm, golden glow pushed back the blue twilight. Eleanor put her mending aside. She got up, cut 2 thick slices of the fresh bread, and spread them with the jam she'd found in the cellar, wild raspberry, tart and sweet. She set 1 slice on a plate in front of Thomas. He put his mending down, looked at the bread, and then up at her. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name since that first day, and it sounded right. Not like a name on a poster or a contract, but like her. Like a fact. They ate the bread as the snow fell thicker outside, wrapping their little cabin in a soft, silent blanket. The past was not forgotten. The fear, the running, the gunshots, they were part of the story now, etched into their history like the scars on Thomas's hands or the new steadiness in Eleanor's own. But they were not the whole story. The whole story was also this, the taste of warm bread and summer raspberries in the heart of a coming winter. The safe, solid feel of a roof over their heads. The silent understanding that passed between them across a lamplit table. It was the quiet promise that from now on, whatever came, they would face it not as a mail-order bride and a burdened rancher, but as partners. They had chosen each other, not in a church or with a fancy pen, but on a rocky ledge and in a dusty street, and that choice, made in the hardest of times, was the strongest foundation of all. The snow kept falling, covering the world in a peaceful, forgiving white, and inside the cabin with the chipped blue door,